Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's webinar, Engaging Your Citizens and Archiving the Social Conversation, How the City of Evanston Ensures Transparency with Social Media, brought to you by Government Technology, Emergency Management, and Archive Social. I'm Harold Tuck, and I'll be your moderator today. We have just a few announcements before we begin. This live webcast is designed to be interactive between you and the presenters. You can participate in the question and answer session by asking questions at any time during the presentation. Just type your questions into the Ask a Question text area next to the video window, and then click the Submit button. At this time, we recommend you disable your pop-up blockers. You will see a number of widgets on the bottom of the screen as well. During today's webinar, you can connect with your peers via LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. If you're experiencing problems with your media player, you can select the Preferences link under the video window and choose a different media player. If you are experiencing any other problems, please visit our webcast help guide by clicking on the Help button below the video window. So let's proceed. The Center for Digital Government provides award-winning presentations covering the information technology's role in the public sector. We also provide research and advisory services on policies and best practices for state and local government in the technology arena. Joining me today would be Luke Stowe, Digital Services Coordinator for the City of Evanston, and Anil Chawla, Founder and Chief Executive Officer of Archive Social. I will be introducing these gentlemen in more detail prior to their presentations. But I wanted to start the conversation with what is happening in social media as it relates to government today. And as you can see on this slide, over half of the participants using social media are what we call the baby boomer generation. So everyone, to some extent, is using the internet and social media to a large degree, as evidenced by the social media landscape. As you look at these logos, they come and go, and changes within the social media landscape is very rapid. So you have to be on top of what's going on as you engage your citizenry. And so let me just give some tidbits as to what are driving these trends out there. One is the fact that there's hyperconnectivity on the internet. You can get on the internet virtually anywhere on the planet. And as a result of that, your citizens don't have to be within your local geographic area to ask you a question and to engage government for government services. And billions of people are on the internet. So that critical mass means that it is a multiplying effect for you. So it's very, very important that you indeed know how to engage your citizens and know how to keep a record of your engagement. Well, what does that really mean as it relates to activities? As you look at these logos and the statistics on each of the logos, that's the activity that happens on social media every 60 seconds, folks. Every 60 seconds. Amazing. So what does that mean for you in government? Our speakers will certainly address this topic for you in much more detail. And before we do, I have a polling question. What is your opinion on social media as a public record? 1, it is definitely a public record by law. 2, it might be a record, but our activity is not worth retaining. 3, I feel strongly that it's not a public record. And finally, you don't know. So please take a moment to answer the polling question as I introduce our next speaker. Mr. Luke Stowe is the Digital Services Coordinator for the City of Evanston, Illinois. He has worked in local government for over 10 years, including technology-related positions at Lake and Champaign counties in Illinois. Luke is a frequent speaker and trainer on many topics, including social media, civic technology, and digital payments. Luke was elected to the Libertyville School District 70 Board in 2013. Let's go over the results of the survey just before Luke speaks. Well, almost 65% of you believe that it's definitely a public record, social media is. Almost 12% of you believe it might be a record, but our activity is not worth retaining. And almost a quarter of you don't know. We're certainly going to answer these questions today. Welcome, Luke, to our webinar.
Thank you, Harold, and I also want to thank eRepublic and Anil for the opportunity to speak today. This is obviously one of my favorite topics. I'm excited to present to the group today. I think we have several people from my home state of Illinois on today's webinar. I first want to start out by saying definitely count me in the camp of there's been some debate in the social gov circles about social media, and in particular Facebook, and I definitely consider myself, at least for now, in the camp of being a very strong proponent of social media and also Facebook as well. Are there potential issues with Facebook and a younger audience, say under 30, and maybe declining participation on Facebook? That's certainly possible, and there's debates on both sides of the issue. But I definitely feel, and I think Harold touched on this a little bit, about the platforms may kind of come and go, and the social media may evolve. But social in and of itself is definitely not going anywhere. And I'm definitely not going to stop sharing interesting stories that we do here in Evanston and other communities are doing in their own communities. For example, on the left-hand side, we have there was on 9/11 there was a remembrance ceremony, and there was a TV reporter from WGN on Channel 9 here in Chicago who took a picture, and she shared it on her own Instagram account. We picked up on that, shared it on our Instagram account and our Facebook page, and of course it was a very popular page. And on the right-hand side, we had about the same time, actually just about a week before Labor Day weekend, we had a very large fire in Evanston. And as they finally put out the fire, and we had lots of assistance from other fire departments in the area here, a rainbow came out at the very end, and the fire chief took a picture of that. So those are the types of stories that we're happy to share with the community, and definitely tend to be very popular. Have we adjusted our strategies on the different platforms, and do we respect the different platforms, LinkedIn versus Facebook versus Twitter versus other platforms? For sure. But we're definitely not leaving Facebook anytime soon. In some cases, we even see on certain posts our organic reach hit 100% or higher. And we do at times also boost posts and do some small advertising through boosting posts. So social media importance and dominance, I think for a lot of the folks that are on this webinar, a lot of this makes sense, but nearly 1/3 of all adult online usage is social media, so there's no ignoring the fact of how much time people are spending their online usage and on social media. The average Facebook user checks their newsfeed 14 times per day, and I always use the example, we have some local newspapers here, traditional newspapers here in Evanston, and if we knew that our residents were reading those newspapers 14 times per day, we would want to be on every single page of that newspaper. So then that holds true for our social media platforms as well. Also, not subscribing to the platforms doesn't make you immune. And what I mean by that is sometimes you'll hear agencies say, well, if we're not on Facebook or we're not on Twitter or we're not on this platform, then no one can say anything bad about us. But the reality is those conversations are already taking place. And it would almost be kind of like saying, well, if we don't subscribe to the Chicago Tribune, then someone can't send a negative letter to the editor about us, and that clearly is not the case. And probably the number one argument, in my opinion, if for no other reason, the importance of social media, and some of what I'm talking about here is not so much directed at the attendees, but maybe there are other folks that are skeptical in your organizations. Maybe there's a skeptical city manager or a skeptical county board or other managers in your organization that feel that social media's time has not come for government agencies. The number one reason, in my opinion, is emergency management. And one example is the City of Boston. I had an opportunity to watch a presentation from Lindsay, who coordinates this social media presence for City of Boston, on a presentation a few weeks ago that she did. And she talked about using social as a way to build up your audience so that when you do have that emergency management issue come up, like a Boston Marathon type situation, you've built up such a strong audience and affinity that it's that much easier to be able to share information with the residents of your city. And so if for no other reason, I think emergency management is a strong selling point. As I mentioned earlier, we've adjusted our strategy, particularly Facebook. I think Fortune 1000 companies now, on average, only share 1 to 2 posts per day. So they've reduced their footprint a little bit as far as the number of postings, but they're being more careful and selective in what they're sharing and focusing more perhaps on storytelling. It used to be a couple years ago on Facebook we would share almost everything on Facebook, and we still do share quite a bit on Twitter, but now we're more selective on what we do share on Facebook. We do quite a few of these webinars, and Neil and I have teamed up on some webinars and some in-person presentations before, and it's fascinating to take a look at who is now involved with social media in government now, and it's just a huge wide range of different types in the government agencies, from PIOs to IT folks, HR, webmasters, city managers, attorneys, and now we're seeing more and more commonly social media directors and coordinators for government agencies. Even smaller or mid-sized cities, it's interesting to see now they have dedicated social media folks, which is great. And also just a wide range of whether it's higher ed, parks and rec, police, child support agencies, sustainability agencies, transportation, senior centers, all types of different agencies now that are in the social media space and want to learn more and do better and use best practices. Some of the stuff we'll talk about today, Julie Tappendorf, who's a partner at Ansel Glink here in Chicago, a law firm, she's truly a national leader and expert on social media issues in government. I would encourage you to take a look at her blog, Municipal Minute, if you have a chance. And also she's written a book on social media in legal issues in government, and I included a link to her book there. She's done some great work in this space, including they've invited I'll talk about it in a minute. The state of Indiana, the governor's office, had some issues with social media. They invited her to come out and do some training there, and I think she proved very helpful to them. So there are First Amendment and limitation issues. One example is the Honolulu Police Department. Some of you might be familiar with, I think it was about a year and a half ago, where the Honolulu Police Department was removing posts that people were posting negative things about the Honolulu Police Department on their Facebook page, and the police department was removing all those negative comments. That created a lot of problems. A lawsuit ensued, and I think they recently settled in the last month or two. I think the cost or the settlement cost was around $20,000, but I don't think that includes all the time, energy that has been spent on this and some of the negative fallout too. And you have to think of social media as essentially like your board meetings, for example. So we all have public board meetings, and we have residents that come to speak. Sometimes they come to compliment or praise the city, and other times they come to criticize the city. And for the most part, almost anything goes at these meetings. There are some certain limitations, but you want to think of your Facebook wall or your Facebook page as analogous to a board meeting. Obviously, there are some limitations. For example, we don't allow hate speech. We don't allow commercial speech. We don't allow campaigning. We just had an election this past week. For the most part, we had no issues with people posting political or campaign comments. We did have a local election last year where we had a little bit of issues with that, and we had to monitor some of that. I mentioned a few minutes ago about the Indiana governor, an intern danger issue. They had an intern working in the governor's office in Indiana who was also removing posts, negative posts about the governor's office. That created a lot of trouble there, and then Indiana decided to come in and do some social media training. And I think that that's a great point where sometimes government agencies are quick to find an intern or a young person and put them in that social media role, which makes a lot of sense for a lot of reasons. But they also need to have guidelines, they need to have policies, and they need training. And they need to know that they can't remove a post just because somebody is critical of the governor. Social media comment policy, this is for the public. I'm going to talk about basically 3 different policies, which sounds like a lot, but we'll break it down so it doesn't sound as intimidating. This is a really simple comment policy that we came up with for the public. I think I borrowed some of this from Arlington, Virginia, maybe a couple other places. We try to keep it really simple and short and understandable for people to read. I think it's the Department of Defense that has something like an 8-page document outlining their social media comment policy. We wanted to have something that was really quick and easy to understand. Most of these are pretty straightforward: no vulgar language, no personal attacks, no promoting particular services, political organizations, or causes. Number 5 is probably the most difficult one, or the grayest area, if you will, where discussion not relevant to topic is potentially grounds for removing a post. When in doubt, I do not remove posts. I only remove posts kind of as a last resort. We'll talk about that a little bit further, but for the most part, we tend to embrace the conversations and try and work with folks if they have a constructive criticism or other comments or issues. The next policy or set of guidelines that I often recommend is social media guidelines for work-related postings. And this also doesn't have to be a 25-page document by any means. I think ours is maybe 3 or 4 pages tops. And basically, we talk about how do you bring value, being interactive, and then when do you be promotional. So we kind of have this 70-20-10 rule. We're always working on this. This is constantly a work in progress. We want to first and foremost be sure that we're bringing value in our posts, in our tweets, to our citizens and residents. We also want to be interactive wherever we can, and then generally we try to be roughly 20%, and then finally 10% where we're actually promoting events or other issues within the city, so that hopefully when in doubt we're doing more listening rather than talking. The guidelines that we talk about for internal staff, we also cover what are the different issues as far as there's often you have positive interactions on these social media platforms, you have neutral interactions, and then you have negative interactions. And then we kind of break down those different negative interactions. You've got just regular issues like, hey, you didn't pick up my garbage this week. You've got constructive criticism, ideas that people are offering. Then you've got kind of what we call merited attacks, where maybe we really truly messed up something. Somebody's very upset by it, but they're being still relatively respectful and reasonable, and we try and work through those issues. And when in doubt, we always try to work through those issues on the social media platforms versus taking it offline. I think it's best from a transparency standpoint to share those answers with people online. And then finally, you've got your last category of haters and trolls. We don't have too much of this, fortunately, right now at Evanston. We have a couple people who are kind of always negative, and sometimes it's best in those cases where you know that there's no answer that we're going to come up with that's going to please them 100%, that sometimes we might just let their comment go and not necessarily respond or get into interaction with them. You also want to make sure that you're familiarizing your staff with the official comment policy. Sometimes we'll see this in local government agencies where they have an official comment policy, but then there's an employee in a certain department who's not necessarily following that comment policy, and they're too quick to pull stuff off the platforms or remove comments. And then also talking about how to respond respectfully. We'll see this not just in government, but other news sites, blogs, and so forth, where the owners of those sites and blogs, in my opinion, can be kind of rude when interacting with their customers, and I think that that's a mistake for sure. And then finally, employees need training. A friend of Anil's and I, Christy Dalton, also known as GovGirl, she started a company called Government Social Media. You can find it at governmentsocialmedia.com. They do online training. That company is also sponsoring a government social media conference that's coming up in April, late April, early May in Reno, Nevada next year. And it's kind of the first of its kind where it's targeted for state, county, and city employees. And it will cover all kinds of different topics, and it's laser focused on social media. So there's a link to the conference at the governmentsocialmedia.com website. So I encourage you to check that out if you're interested in training, whether it be online or in-person training at the conference. And then lastly, this is a tricky one, the employee personal social media usage at work and home. Many government agencies and workplaces have basically a minimal use policy, where there's some understanding that people might occasionally check their Facebook account or tweet something out. There's other government agencies that have basically a zero tolerance for that. I think that that's probably a mistake, especially now in this age of smartphones and millennials. The first thing, if you have a zero tolerance on the desktop or the laptop that they're using for work, the first thing that they're going to use their smartphone. And so I think that it's entirely reasonable to expect some minimal usage. Employers are able to monitor what people are doing on the internet and the web with notice, and they can discipline if needed. At a previous employer, I know that there was one person who was spending 6 or 7 hours a day shopping on eBay, and that person was disciplined, and that issue was addressed. So clearly that's a violation. I think in many cases, things like that are really not so much an issue with web or social media, but more of a management issue. Employees behaving badly on personal time. This is a tricky one. There was a case of a school teacher who was photographed in a slightly risque photo, and she ended up getting fired from her position. She appealed it. There was some sort of compromise. I think it was an overreaction by the school district in this particular case. Obviously, there are more egregious examples where it's more obvious. For example, there were a couple other examples, like there was a person who posted on their personal Facebook that said, "I wish I could get fired, I hate my job," and she went kind of on and on. Well, her employer did see that posting on Facebook. Even though it's on her personal page, on her personal time, she was terminated, and the termination was upheld by the courts. There was another example of a 911 operator who took a screenshot while he was at work, posted on his personal Facebook page of a patient. There was HIPAA implications, just really not a great idea, and I'm surprised that the person went to that. They included personal information, including name and I think address and some other personal information. That person was terminated, and that termination was also upheld. What's a little bit more of a grayer area is water cooler conversations, where people are complaining, let's say, on social media about workplace conditions, and there is protections or some protections for that type of issue. For example, if someone is working in an office that is maybe it's too cold at work, and they're complaining about how cold it is at work and the heat's not working, something like that, and other employees might be participating in that conversation, there is some protection for that. There's also protection for political speech. There was an example of a sheriff's office where some of the deputy sheriffs had liked their boss's opponent's Facebook page during a political campaign for sheriff. After the sheriff won re-election, he then terminated those employees because they had liked his opponent's page. They sued, and they were able to get their jobs back. And that is an example of protected political speech, much in the same way that you're free to put up a yard sign for whoever you wish to support politically. There's also, you want to have discussions with your personnel about what constitutes appropriate personal posting. It's tricky arena because some employers have gone too far in that, and then they've had to scale back. One recommendation is including employee usage policies in employee personnel handbooks, so they have it as a reference. Real quick, I wanted a couple tips and tricks here. There's a Facebook review section that some of you might be familiar with, where people can, almost much like Yelp, within Facebook, you can give an organization or a restaurant or a business a 1 to 5 star rating. If you want to remove the star ratings, and one of the reasons I recommend considering removing it is because there's no ability to moderate the comments that people put in there. And we've had issues before where people put some kind of crazy stuff in there, and then we can't moderate those comments like you can on regular comments to posts. So you can actually go to Settings, Page Info, Edit Address, and then uncheck Show Mapbox. And by doing that, you can remove those star ratings and those comments that go along with it. One example is we had somebody who came, I think they were visiting Evanston, they got a parking ticket, then they went on our Facebook page and gave us 1 star because they were upset that they got a parking ticket, which is kind of unfair. You know, in theory, the city did nothing wrong in that case, and we got a 1 star rating for that. Real quick on Facebook, hiding or removing posts. This is kind of a newer feature that you now have the option to hide a post, which is always, in my opinion, the first option. If it's kind of a gray area, you're not sure whether to remove this post or not, maybe consider hiding it. In that case, the post is only visible to the user and their Facebook friends and nobody else. So if they're kind of screaming at the world, or they think they're screaming at the world, in reality, they're the only ones that can see it, and perhaps maybe some of their Facebook friends that they're connected to. So that's an interesting idea before actually going ahead and removing the post altogether. When you click to hide, you also get other options like you can unhide if you made a mistake, you can delete the post, you can report the user, or you can ban the user, which always, in my opinion, banning a user is the absolute last resort. I would only do that in circumstances where they've repeatedly broken policies time and time again. And you can always grab a screenshot if you're not using Archive Social or something like that. You can grab a screenshot and then save that for your law or legal department if ever needed. Nimbus is a tool that you can use within Chrome to grab screenshots really easily. Adding comment policies to Facebook and Twitter, this is very important as well. On Facebook, you can edit your short description and include a shortened URL to your social media comment policy. Within Twitter, you can also edit your bio. And then also it's important to, I think, put the disclaimer that follows and retweets and likes do not equal endorsement. Just because we follow a politician on Twitter who may have interesting and compelling information to share with our audience doesn't mean that we're necessarily endorsing that person for the upcoming election. You also want to state that you're the official account for that city or county, and also you can get verified on Twitter. If people have questions about that, feel free to reach out to me or Anil. We can share the process to get your Twitter account verified by Twitter and get that little blue check mark. And then also for personal accounts, I always recommend that people consider putting tweets of my own and retweets and follows do not equal endorsement, so there's a disclaimer that just because I might tweet about something doesn't mean that it's reflective of the City of Evanston's opinion. In that case, it's my own personal opinion. Listening and embracing negative comments, this kind of goes in with the transparency that we were talking about. In some cases, citizens or residents might not know even the full story, or maybe they're missing some facts, and you can kind of fill them in on that. We also try to embrace proactive social media listening, where even if someone's not directly using our Twitter handle, but they're talking about an icy sidewalk in Evanston, we'll try and pick up on that conversation, share that with 301, and get that issue resolved. In most cases, people are surprised or delighted because they didn't think that anyone would be listening. We use Hootsuite for that. GeoFeedy is also another option for monitoring posts in a geotag respect. You can often turn negative users into neutral or positive by just simply working with them, answering their questions. Other users can often come to the rescue too. We've had that many times where maybe somebody's upset about something and another citizen or resident has chimed in some cases to defend the city or explain something better than maybe we can. I always recommend people answering on those platforms. Sometimes you'll see government agencies will say, well, why don't you call us or email us? I think it's best if you can try and handle it right on the social media platform so that other people can see what we're doing. Sometimes it's best to let it go. I've mentioned that earlier that in some cases there's some folks that you just can't make happy, and maybe it's just best to let a comment or a question go if needed. I think it offers great transparency and open government when you are using these social media platforms to communicate with residents in a real-time fashion. Lastly, I wanted to mention the case of here in Illinois, we had an issue with the Peoria mayor. There was a group of 20-somethings that started a fake parody Twitter account. Anyone who had visited the account, and it only had a few dozen users or followers, anyone who would have visited this Twitter handle would have realized that it was a parody account. It was kind of inappropriate, but again, it was pretty obvious that it was a parody account. The mayor found out about it. He got extremely upset about it. He ordered the police to basically raid their apartment at 6 in the morning. They took their computers out. They got arrested. There were other issues. And to me, it was a real overreaction. And now there's federal lawsuits pending, First and Fourth Amendment violations. There's been political fallout. It's hurt the police. The state's attorney ultimately decided that there was no crime committed here. It was just simply a Twitter parody account, and there was no impersonating a public official, which is what the police and the mayor were trying to initially state. So I think that we've got to. I think the case with Mayor Rahm Emanuel in Chicago was a better example of trying to have fun with your parody accounts rather than trying to shut them down. After the arrest, I think 40 or 50 new parody Twitter accounts sprung up in the wake of that. So it truly backfired in this case. That's the end of my presentation. I just wanted to mention briefly that the City of Evanston does use Archive Social for our records retention for social media. We've been using them for about 2 years now. I first met Anil at a NAGWA conference back in 2012. We've been very happy with the product. I'd be happy to answer questions for anybody offline if they have questions about our work with Archive Social.
Thank you, Luke. Very, very good. Also, just real briefly, you can participate in the Q&A session very interactively Make sure you click on the link and submit your question in the text area. And our next speaker will be Anil Chawla, and we will have time for Q&A right after his presentation. We have another poll question. Please take some time to answer that right now as I introduce our next speaker. Mr. Anil Chawla is the founder and chief executive officer of Archive Social, a Durham, North Carolina-based company that specializes in archiving social media for public records requirements. His company was selected for the prestigious Code for America Accelerator in 2013 and recognized as a 2014 Cool Vendor in Government by leading analyst firm Gartner. Please join me in welcoming Anil Chawla to our presentation and webcast. Welcome, Anil.
Harold, thanks so much, and Luke as well. I really do always enjoy listening to Luke talk about social media and how they're approaching these channels at the city of Evanston. I find that Luke's advice is extremely pragmatic, and he's someone that constantly experiments, and therefore is often figuring out new techniques and tips for really succeeding with social media channels. So I think it's a real treat for us to have Luke with us here today. I also do want to second what Luke said about the Government Social Media Conference, which is taking place at the end of April next year, in just a few months. This is an event that both Government Technology and Archive Social are involved with, and should be a really great event to get deep down into the inner workings of social media and how to succeed with social media in government. Now, we do have a poll on the screen here. Hopefully you've seen it up there, had a chance to respond to it. I'm going to leave it up there for just a few more seconds. These polls, both the first poll that we looked at in regards to public records as well as this poll around record keeping, will really help me target the rest of my presentation towards the issues that can impact this audience the most. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and push us to the results of this poll. Hopefully you've made your selection. And what we see right away is consistent, honestly, with what we're seeing across the country in terms of social media records retention. About 70% of you today are not doing anything to specifically retain social media. You're relying on the social networks like Facebook and Twitter. Don't feel bad. Again, this is where a lot of government is today. And of course, my intention in this webinar is to give you both the motivation as well as the viable approach that you might take to get your hands around this issue. I am glad to see that another 12% are doing manual captures. We had also folks using automated solutions, and of course Archive Social customer here as well, so thank you for joining us. So for those of you who are doing something today, kudos to you for recognizing the importance of this problem and taking action. Real quick, just to give you a quick agenda for the next 20 minutes or so that I'll be spending in this webinar, I'm going to talk about the importance of retaining social media as a record, and I'm going to do that by really focusing on real-life examples and case studies. We'll touch on the law, but I think those examples are more powerful. One of my goals of the webinar here is not just to talk about this problem, but really talk about some solutions, and I'm going to walk through a handful of different options that you can evaluate to figure out what suits your agency the best. Time permitting, I think we'll have very limited time for this, but if we have just a minute or two, I do want to show you a quick demonstration of an automated archive so that you can understand what it means to retain social media and how you can access important records that are potentially years old across an archive of thousands of records out there. And of course, we will have time for Q&A towards the end, so if you do have any questions, please go ahead and start filling them out in the Q&A box. It looks like we're having a little bit of an issue with the slide deck itself, but hopefully this is readable. Just to kick it off, let's talk about why this is even an issue you should be thinking about in Illinois. Well, it does start with your records law, the Freedom of Information Act, which really is modeled off of the Federal Freedom of Information Act. And this law was written many decades ago, but it does apply to our modern day communications. And the reason why it does apply is because it was written very broadly. In fact, in virtually every public records law you'll see across the country, you'll find the phrase, regardless of physical form. Regardless of physical form, communications that have been prepared by, sent, transmitted, received, regardless of physical form, these communications are government records worth retaining. And to make that concrete, if you receive a citizen complaint, most of us have a schedule for a citizen complaint, or if you receive a crime tip as a law enforcement agency, These are certainly records that are worth keeping. It doesn't matter if you receive a crime tip on a piece of paper, in an email, or over a tweet. A crime tip is a crime tip, and it has importance based on that nature of that content. Now, that is the law as it's written. And basically, the point I'm making there is that the law doesn't have to change. It didn't have to change for email, although many jurisdictions did update the law to say electronic communications when government was trying to get its hands around email a decade or so ago. And of course, we know a decade or so ago, we had the same confusion around whether email really was a record worth keeping. And today, the answer is very clear that important business is being transacted on email, and it's creating lots of important records. And so these laws have been updated to say electronic communication. And of course, social media is just another form of electronic communication. A few key things to keep in mind is that it's not just what you put out there. In fact, that third-party conversation, those citizen comments, those replies, are just as important and far less in your control. So you do need to think about how you can retain these records per your retention schedules. So let's jump in and look at some real-life examples. I know part of the poll was, asking you if you felt that social media is a record, and I know a good percentage of you answered that yes, technically by definition, social media would be a record, but our content isn't worth keeping. And what I want to do here is just give you a few examples to get you thinking about your own social media and perhaps reconsider whether or not your social media is generating content worth keeping, records of value. The very first example where this becomes painfully obvious that social media is creating records of value is in times of emergency. Luke touched on this. I agree with him fully that emergency response, if you only needed one reason to be on social media and to create an audience on social media, it's to be ready during times of emergency so that you have an audience that can receive your message and help virally spread it to the public. We've seen this happen many times over and over in the last few years. Boston Marathon bombings, as Luke mentioned, is a great example. And you can look at any of these incidents. These are situations where an emergency is happening. Government agencies have no time to put content on a website and then cross-post it to social media or to run an official press release. You need to get that information out as quickly as possible to help inform and protect the public. And Twitter and Facebook and these other social networks have clearly become some of the most effective, efficient channels for getting that information out. So in a time of emergency, you're going to create content that is unique to social media. It's going to have value. And one really, I think, interesting example is sort of a trivia fact. In the Boston Marathon bombings, when the Boston PD was searching for the suspect, and they finally caught the suspect, the very first announcement that they captured the suspect was a tweet. It wasn't a press conference. It wasn't a tip to a journalist. It wasn't an update on their website. It was simply a tweet. And so you can see how that communication had tremendous value, created a unique record that needs to be retained. And it's not just times of emergency, but day in and day out, there are many crises, there are many emergencies. Public safety and law enforcement are often dealing with these. And more finding that social media is extremely effective for asking for crime tips and soliciting information, as well as just getting information out there. We're also seeing agencies like 311 help centers integrate with social media so that it's much easier for a citizen to report a problem like a pothole or broken traffic light. So there's certainly lots of agencies that are finding ways to integrate with social media and to improve their contribution as an agency and to really help fulfill their goals. And ultimately, we have to remember that government exists to serve the citizens. And so regardless of what kind of government agency you are, ultimately what you're providing is service to the citizens, customer service. And we've seen time and time again that social media is an extremely effective channel for customer service. And as you get more and more involved with social media, you'll find that you're creating records that are unique because a citizen might have a complaint or a question that it just simply makes sense to address it right there on the social network. Now, a unique example, I know Luke touched on this as well, sometimes it's not just your core purpose as an agency that brings social media into the mix, but we're also seeing agencies utilize social media for all sorts of functions, such as recruitment. So here's an example of a sheriff's office putting information out about a job posting and then clarifying some of that information, all happening on social media. Anytime you have these conversations, which really is what social media is all about, you're going to create communications that don't exist elsewhere, and some percentage of those communications are going to have long-term value. Now, to tie it all together, you may ask, well, okay, fine, maybe we're performing some customer service, maybe we've had a flood or drought or some kind of emergency where we've put information out on social media that doesn't exist elsewhere. But who's really going to ask for this, and what's the problem of just sending them, to Twitter or Facebook to find it themselves? Well, in April of this year, the Seattle PD received this tweet. Seattle PD has a number of Twitter feeds which basically tweet out police events, crime events, kind of like a police scanner but on Twitter. And a citizen had been following these Twitter feeds and noticed that there were some issues with content being delayed or missing, and started tweeting to Seattle PD, and in a couple of tweets in actually said, I just want the archives of all of your Twitter feeds, and please consider this a public records request. So in other words, this citizen made a public records request for social media using social media. And the citizen actually followed up with some more detailed questions because he was really trying to figure out if Seattle PD's Twitter feed was lining up to contain all of the police activity that should have been coming out on those feeds. So this is happening. This is a very obvious example of someone requesting social media records. But this doesn't typically happen, at least not yet today. It probably will become more prevalent over time. Even though people are not necessarily requesting social media records from you today, they might be giving you a records request that would include social media. So we often see records requests that are along the lines of, they start with any or all documents related to X, Y, and Z. Any or all electronic communications related to X, Y, and Z. These broader requests, which you sometimes can't scope down, technically do include social media, and they often do. So to really fulfill your requirement to the transparency laws in your state, and also to mitigate risk of not being caught missing that information, it's important to think about how social media might fit into some of those broader requests. So hopefully I've made the case now that there are many examples of records being created on social media that are worth keeping, and some of that may overlap with your own social media usage. But at the end of the day, we have to figure out, for us to take action on this issue, it's always a risk versus benefit, risk versus cost equation. And there are just a few case studies I want to cover here really quickly, just to give you some background, to also help you think about when you do start solving this problem, what are the issues to take into consideration. The first case study here actually deals with email. Like I said, what we're going through with social media right now is exactly what we went through with email several years ago. And now we have a tremendous amount of case law around email. And so this case study really highlights the importance of thinking about how you keep records. It's not just about having some record. It's about having a proper record. In this lawsuit, the city of Shoreline, Washington was requested to produce an email. They were able to produce a copy of the email, but not the original email. Now, the citizen who requested this realized that they were getting a copy of the email, which had all of the email content in it, but they really wanted the original. And so they actually requested the city produce the original email with all of the original metadata. Now, if you're not familiar with the term metadata, metadata is information that's embedded within this email. So it's information about who sent it, what computer servers it went across, the various timestamps, and so forth. It's the technical information that's a part of the email message. The city could not produce the original email and therefore did not have the original metadata. This actually went to the Supreme Court in 2010 in Washington. The state of Washington Supreme Court ruled that yes, the metadata is part of the public record, and yes, the city should be able to produce it. They ended up fining the city $100,000, so the city ultimately had to settle this case for more than $500,000 in order to cover the plaintiff's fees. And what it showed was that having some copy of that email, even though it had the content of the email, was not good enough. By not having an authentic, complete record of that email, it cost the city $500,000. Something to think about in terms of your long-term records management strategy. Now, how this translates into social media, we're going to go through a number of different solutions, but not all of those solutions will capture the metadata and provide that full record. And if you look at social media, it has the same issue as email. Even a tweet, which is only 140 characters, has more than 2,000 characters of metadata. So you really have to think about how you'll get that data, and ultimately that could be information that's requested. The second legal case study is a little closer to home with social media, although it doesn't deal with freedom of information in any way. Rather, Honolulu Police Department had been moderating some content on their Facebook page that they were receiving from a pro-gun group. The content was very pro-gun oriented. The police department decided to remove it. The citizens then decided to file a First Amendment lawsuit claiming that they had a freedom of speech to express their opinions on gun control on this site, on this Facebook page. And so this became a lawsuit. As Luke indicated, you want to be really careful about moderating based on relevance. This is the first of its kind lawsuit that really got to the heart of whether the government can moderate based on information being relevant to the discussion. It was not actually settled. Instead, well, I would say it was not ruled upon. The City of Honolulu decided to settle the case by paying about $30,000 in plaintiff's attorney's fees earlier this year. But what it brings to light is that as a government, when you're communicating over social media, those communications can find their way to court just like any other government communications. And in this case, the City of Honolulu was taken to court for communications that they had deleted. Well, if you're going to court based on something that you've already deleted, it's really hard to tell your side of the story unless you've kept records of what you deleted and you can explain why you deleted it, right? So many of you, I'm sure, are moderating content on your social media. Please make sure that you're keeping some sort of record before you remove that content. I'm going to skip through this slide. The basic point here is that unlike files and email, social media exists on Twitter.com servers, Facebook.com servers, and your IT department doesn't have this data. So if you're in communications or you're dealing with social media, you need to figure out a way to satisfy FOIA requirements in order to use these channels. And IT may not be able to help you internally. They may be able to help you vet a product and purchase a product or put some kind of technology in place, but they don't have the data. So what I want to do is transition here in the last few minutes is talk about some solutions. The number one thing is that there is no, that's not the number one thing, but the number one thing to keep in mind is that social media is not a one-way platform. In fact, you cannot turn off comments. You cannot turn off replies. And so you do have to embrace the fact this is a two-way conversation and think about all the communications you're receiving and how you will retain them. But the number one thing to keep in mind is that Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, these other sites have made absolutely zero commitment to retaining information and records for your governmental requirements, for the FOIA requirements. So right now you're hoping that the data is out there on Facebook and Twitter, and hopefully it is. But over time, there's no guarantee that you'll be able to get to your history the way you can today. And more importantly, if anything is deleted, it's gone forever. So you may not delete anything you post. You may trust that everybody in the agency will be good about not deleting anything they ever post. But your citizens can certainly send you messages that have important content in it and then change their mind and delete it. And when they delete it, you have no idea. You might not have any idea that the content has been deleted. And once it's deleted, it's gone forever, and you've lost a record that should have been maintained per your retention requirements. So social networking sites are a kind of a temporary place for that data. You need to figure out a long-term storage for your retention. So here's a few approaches, starting with the most basic, moving to the most sophisticated. The first is manual archiving, taking screenshots. It sounds very archaic. A lot of governments, though, who are wanting to be proactive on this, or at least are doing this, which I think is a great thing. Particularly if you're moderating content, as we saw with Honolulu, at least have a screenshot. What you need to keep in mind with screenshots, though, is that although it's free to take screenshots, your time is not free. We've had customers with moderate social media presences spend more than 20 to 30 hours a month taking screenshots in order to be comprehensive. And it's just a waste of your time as someone with more responsibilities than that. But also, one of the issues with screenshots is that it's not a long-term strategy because it's difficult to maintain and organize, but also the screenshots are not records that you can necessarily validate. So someone could just, if it went to court and you were using a screenshot as your evidence, someone could easily ask if you had photoshopped it or dispute that screenshot unless you figured out some other way to prove the authenticity of it. A better approach is to move to automated tools. For a number of years, there have been backup tools in the consumer space around social media, tools like Backupify and SocialSafe. Very inexpensive. These are built for individuals to use for their backing up their own social media. The thing to keep in mind with these tools, this is a screenshot from Backupify, is they were not made for government record keeping. and they are just simple backups. So they're not necessarily going to have comprehensive capture of the data with full resolution imagery and your entire comment thread. They don't do anything to protect that data and to ensure that you can use it in legal situations. And most importantly, it's just a simple backup, so they don't provide the tools to recreate that information and produce it. So if you're responding to a public information request, being able to recreate a Facebook conversation can be virtually impossible. If you look at the screenshot right now, we're looking at a Facebook wall, but you really wouldn't be able to tell that. So it's a very, very basic capture, but these tools are very inexpensive. I believe SocialSafe is somewhere on the order of $20 a year. SocialSafe will store the data to your local machine. It's not based in the cloud, so you still need to figure out somewhere to store that data once SocialSafe takes a snapshot. But it is inexpensive if you have a limited budget. A better approach is to look at archiving. So if you really want to solve this problem with peace of mind and have the kind of tools and storage of data that really will protect your government, provide you with more than $20 worth of protection, you want to look at archiving. There are a number of archiving vendors out there coming from email and website archiving, and then there's social media archiving vendors as well. What we want to keep in mind, though, is if you run into a vendor that does it all, you have to figure out if they truly do it all or if they do certain things really well and certain things not so well. We've seen with some email archiving vendors that they are excellent at archiving email, but with social media, they're trying to just jam the social media information into their existing email archive, which means that they're splitting up conversations into multiple emails or converting the data. There's data loss. And so you don't have all that metadata. You have a really difficult time of piecing back together a conversation. And you really don't have the tools that you would need to produce information, even though it's easy to say that you've stored it all in one place. So something to think about. These vendors are getting better and better, so it's worth evaluating what they do. Ultimately, at Archive Social, we decided to focus on being a social media archiving vendor. And what it boiled down to are these 4 factors. How quickly can you get the content before it's lost from the network? Are you comprehensive? Do you have both sides of the conversation? Do you have full resolution videos and photos? And do you have that metadata? Because we've seen legal precedent around metadata being important. Third is authenticity. Can you prove that the record is what it is in a legal situation, so that if it were to be challenged, you could actually hold that record up as evidence? And finally, do you have the context to make sense of that information? I think this is perhaps the most overlooked criteria in terms of context. If you're trying to produce a Facebook conversation from 4 years ago that has 100 comments on it that spanned over 2 months, with most solutions that were not built for social media, it's virtually impossible. So how can you recreate that conversation instantly, save yourself the time and headache, avoid missing information so that you can produce the full conversation and timeline? That context is incredibly important. Those are the factors that we look at Archive Social, and that's why we've decided to focus specifically on social media archiving to get it right. Given our time frame, I'm going to go ahead and just skip the demo. I do want to mention that we do have some open archives out there, though, where you can try out our product and see how governments like the state of North Carolina, city of Austin, and Snohomish County, which had the mudslide emergency earlier this year, they've all been archiving with us, and they've decided to make their open records completely open so that citizens can access these records without creating overhead for these agencies. In fact, Snohomish County has received more than 40 public information requests for the landslide, and where it makes sense, they're able to direct citizens directly to their social media archive to see how Snohomish County was alerting the public during that emergency. And with that, I'm going to bring my contact information up and hand it back to Harold so that we can address your questions.
Neil, thank you very much. Very informative. And let's just get right into the questions right now, folks, because we have several. And here's a question. What direction, if any, should educational institutions take in regards to social media? Should they act the same way as government, or should they take a different strategy or direction? Which one of you guys want to go handle that first?
I could take a quick stab at that. I think that the issues and the general guidelines are very similar, especially if it's a state university, so it's already a public entity like other local government agencies. I think the main difference might be, for example, Nikki Sundstrom, who runs the social media for University of Michigan. I know that they introduced Snapchat because Snapchat's really popular among 13 to 25-year-olds. So I think you just have to look at your audience in higher ed, where your target audience is a little bit different than local government agencies, and maybe it's the platforms that are different, not so much the way that you approach social media in general.
Interesting. Thanks, Luke. What about you and Neil? You want to respond?
Yes, I absolutely agree with Luke. Obviously, there's certain concerns like public records, so we do a lot of work with universities and school systems. What we're also seeing, though, is that there's a perceived higher risk sometimes in the school environment because you are dealing, particularly K through 12, dealing with students and teachers. And so when folks approach us for our platform, it's not just for public records, it's for also consolidating and centralizing some oversight. And so with that educational environment, you do have to think about who officially is going to have a social media presence. And being in such a distributed environment, say that you're a school district, you may have several schools that have official presences. And then within a school, you may have actual classrooms and teachers that have a presence. So I think there are some strategies that need to be worked out in the education space. So we're still, we see the industry is still trying to figure out those best practices to handle those various layers. And thinking about how you can centralize oversight and establish consistent policies is extremely important up front.
Thank you.
The last thing I would add is there's also some issues with teachers and students friending each other on the different social media platforms, and I know different school districts have different policies. So that's one other thing for them to consider.
Well, Luke, I want you to take this first, follow up the next question, followed by Neil. This is an interesting question. I'm going to read it specifically, but when you answer it, I want you to be a little bit more expansive as it relates to human resources departments. But the actual question is, do you know of any laws prohibiting police departments directing people to log into social media during a background check phase?
Yes, that's a great question. I know Illinois was one of the first states to pass a law, I think back in 2012, that took effect in January of 2013, essentially banning employers from asking for social media passwords to the platforms. I personally think it's probably over the top a little bit. I mean, how far are you going to go with that? You're going to ask for people's personal email accounts, their text messages, letters to their spouse. So this one's a little bit tricky because I think they're asking specifically about police departments. Obviously, if you're going to be working for a police department or an intelligence agency, it's a little bit of a different ballgame than if you're just going to be working for the Public Works Department or something like that. But I know probably the best thing for them to do is check out the ncsl.org website, which is the National Conference of State Legislatures. I think there's like 30 states that are either considering or have already passed laws relevant to asking for social media passwords.
Thank you. And Neil, you have any comment?
No, I think Luke covered that really well.
Okay, so let's keep these responses brief so I can get to two more questions. The next one is, what about reliability in social media? For example, if someone creates a social media account in my name, how would you account for that situation? Or would all that has to happen is to go to court and prove it's not your account?
Yeah, so,
Neil,
for example, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to have, yeah, and then you chime in second. Neil?
Well, I do want to hand this to Luke, because I know, Luke, you're more familiar with entities trying to grab the URLs and names that are actually belong to your entity versus people that are kind of posing there. So go ahead.
I was just going to mention that both Facebook and Twitter, as examples, have policies or processes. If there is truly somebody out there trying to impersonate or use your city logo or city seal and not identify themselves as a parody account, and it's truly misleading citizens or residents, both those platforms, and I think the other platforms too, have policies or procedures to deal with those. And if anyone is dealing with that, I'd be happy to chat with someone offline on how to go about that and notify the platforms.
Okay, here's the final question. And Luke, you mentioned this. Could you reiterate again why you had to adjust your Facebook strategy?
So I think we're constantly reevaluating what we're doing on all the platforms. Facebook in particular is known for constantly tweaking their newsfeed algorithm. So what might work a year ago might not work as well now. And so, for example, we used to Facebook everything. If there was a road closure, we'd Facebook it. If there was some event coming up, we'd Facebook it. So we've been more selective and more careful and trying to focus on truly Facebook posts that offer the most value, tell a story, or share a great article about the city from another organization or news site. Those tend to be the most popular. So we've kind of just tweaked what we share, how often we share it. to be basically relevant and still remain popular with the algorithm?
Thank you. I want to be mindful of the 1 hour commitment we had,